Well, once again, good evening, everyone. Today is July 17th, 2021, and I want to welcome you warmly to today's Bible study. And today we'll be tackling one of the tougher books, in my opinion, in the sacred scriptures, and that is the Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, there's no way in the time that we have that we're going to get through the entire book, but I wanted to at least begin and go through the first 4 chapters. And even that is going to be quite a chore. And I'm just going to be, as you can imagine, skimming over the surface on many of these issues. However, I think you'll get a taste of it. And I think it'll help us to start thinking about these things in a more comprehensive way to help us to truly understand on the deeper level Almighty Yahweh's plan of salvation. As I put it in the promotional message for the study, that we can see Yahweh's plan to save the world, which is quite frankly what Romans is about. The book of Romans is something that it takes a lot of study to really truly understand it. It's one of the more profound books, in my opinion. And when I say book, please understand I'm referring to a letter. It is a letter to the people of Rome, and particularly to the assembly or assemblies, plural, in Rome. But it's one of the more profound of the letters, because there are a number of things that the Apostle Paul, who is the writer, goes into, are doctrinal issues that will have ramifications throughout all of his letters, and indeed ramifications dealing with the entire sacred scriptures and Yahweh's plan for mankind. But I don't want, and any time we look at the scriptures, including today, and perhaps especially today, it's so important for me that we look at the scriptures not from a perspective of doctrine, right? So many times we tend to study things in a very, not we, but people in general, right? We tend to look at things in a very pedantic sort of way, in a way that's meant to get through a lesson. Our purpose when we look at the scriptures is never to get through a lesson, right? Our purpose is to understand that word as it pertains to our lives. I don't study doctrine. I don't study theology. And by that, I don't mean that I don't touch upon those things. What I'm saying is that when I study things, I don't study with the intent of studying theology. I don't study with the intent of studying doctrine. I promise you that I'm not in the slightest bit interested personally in making sure that we all study doctrine. What I want to do is I want to study those doctrines and that theology and those teachings only for one end, to understand what that means on a very real, practical level for us here as human beings living here on this earth, serving Almighty Yahweh from the heart. So as we go into the book of Romans, right, when we look at terms like justification or righteousness, same thing. And we look at terms like salvation, or we consider terms like grace, or whatever it is that we're going to come across, we're not looking at those things from the perspective of doctrine and theology. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in getting into theological arguments or winning the debate with other individuals who study the Bible. That's not important to me. What I want to understand is what those terms meant to the people to whom they were originally given, and what they mean to us today, because they have a very real significance to us today that's going to help us to live better, that's going to help us to understand what Yahweh wants of us, that's going to help us understand Yahshua the Messiah, who he is, what he did for us, and what he's going to do for us moving forward. The book of Romans, the letter to the Romans, was written by the Apostle Paul to encourage those in the assembly at Rome, but also to explain in a deep way what this plan of Yahweh is for both Jews and Gentiles. And when I say Gentiles, I mean the nations, non-Jews. So as we go through these first 4 chapters, and as we start to get a sense of what Paul, the big picture of what Paul is speaking of and what he's trying to convey to the worshipers of Yahweh, I want us to really take these things to heart. I want us to really try to internalize them and make them a part of us so that we can be encouraged by them, so that we can look at these things and say, wow, this is going to help me to truly serve Yahweh in a more intimate way, in a more authentic way. It's going to help me with my family. It's going to help me when I'm witnessing to other people about what Yahweh has done for me and what Yahweh wants to do for them as well. And by the way, as you can see, I'm not coming from my normal home location today. My wife and I are on the road, and we're really grateful to the Echeverry family in North Carolina for the use of their home for our studio today. So we're going to have a little bit of difference going on today in the surroundings. You might hear a dog bark or two, or see a child or two running across the screen. It's all par for the course, right? This is how we live. So I want to thank Almighty Yahweh for the opportunity to be able to do these things on the move. And this is our desire, to get out there among the brothers and sisters and to just really interact with people and live and enjoy, right? This is what Paul wanted to do with the Romans. And believe me, I'm not comparing myself in any way to Paul. I'm just using that as an example. This is what Paul desired. He wanted to be among his brothers and sisters. And he had tried to get to the Romans several times, and he had been prevented from doing so for a number of reasons. But this is what life is all about, right? It's about getting together, communicating with one another, loving one another. We're not going to cover it today, but Romans chapter 12 is a chapter that we read frequently, right? And that's the chapter that talks about the love that characterizes the people of Yahweh. Chapter 12 is sort of a peak of, after all the things that he describes about the family of Yahweh, both Jew and Gentile. It all comes to a head between chapters 9 through 11. And then when you get to 12, he gives a big grand manifesto, if you will, of the love that should exist among all of Yahweh's people. And this is what I'm hoping to convey as we go through this material, and to try to the best of my understanding, to try to clarify some things that Paul is speaking of, with the understanding, of course, and the caveat that I too am still learning many of these things, and I'm still refining my own understanding. So, I promise that I do not have all the answers, right? The book of Romans is something that better men than I have studied in, over the centuries. But I'm going to give you a sense to the best of my understanding, and then hopefully that will help you to truly appreciate the letter to the Romans, and that we could leave here with some information that's going to strengthen our faith in Almighty Yahweh. So with that in mind, and with no further ado, let's turn to the book of Romans. And as is my custom, I'm going to read it in a more dynamic equivalent translation. In other words, a more modern sounding translation that is still faithful, very faithful to the text. And that is the New Kingdom translation by N.T. Wright. So let me go ahead and bring that up. And in just a moment, I will have that ready for you. And then we'll go to more traditional texts as we analyze the book, in a deeper fashion. Did I say New Kingdom? It's the Kingdom New Testament. That's what it is. The Kingdom New Testament. I want to quote that accurately. Okay. So we're going to read through chapters 1 through 4, and then we'll come back and unpack it in a deeper fashion. The letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 1. Good news. Excuse me, I was reading the subheaders. Let's not do that. The letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 1. Paul, a slave of King Yahshua, called to be an apostle, set apart for Yahweh's good news, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the sacred writings. The good news about his son, who was descended from David's seed in terms of flesh, and who was marked out powerfully as Yahweh's son in terms of the spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead. Yahshua, the King, our sovereign. Through him we have received grace and apostleship to bring about believing obedience among all the nations for the sake of his name. That includes you too, who were called by Yahshua the King. This letter comes to all in Rome who love Elohim, all who are called to be his holy people. Grace and peace to you from Yahweh our Father and King Yahshua the Sovereign. Let me say first that I thank my Elohim for all of you through Yahshua the King, because all the world has heard the news of your faith. Yahweh is my witness. The Elohim I worship in my spirit and the good news of his Son, that I never stop remembering you in my prayers. I ask Elohim again and again that somehow at last I may now be able in his good purposes to come to you. I'm longing to see you. I want to share with you some spiritual blessing to give you strength. That is, I want to encourage you and be encouraged by you in the faith you and I share. I don't want you to be unaware, my dear family, that I've often made plans to come to you. It's just that up to now, something has always gotten in the way. I want to bear some fruit among you, as I've been doing among the other nations. I'm under obligation to barbarians as well as to Greeks, you see, both to the wise and to the foolish. That's why I'm eager to announce the good news to you too in Rome. I'm not ashamed of the good news. It is Yahweh's power bringing salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also equally to the Greek. This is because Yahweh's covenant justice is unveiled in it, from faithfulness to faithfulness. As it says in the scriptures, the just shall live by faith. And I need to pause here and say a couple of things. I've not been comfortable with this translation to, as it says in the Bible. I understand what he's trying to do. I feel more comfortable saying the scriptures. So whenever you see me say, substitute, that's the reason why. Something wrong with saying the Bible. I know he's just trying to be more convivial, but I'm just going to keep it with the scriptures. But more importantly, this term, covenant justice, I've described this a number of times in recent months. And I just want to say, this is where you would normally see the word righteousness. Yahweh's righteousness is unveiled in it. That's in verse 17. So you'll normally see the word, the righteousness, about the term, the righteousness of Elohim. And he continually translates it as covenant justice for reasons that'll become clearer as we go through it. Yahweh's covenant justice is unveiled in it, from faithfulness to faithfulness. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. As it says in the scriptures, the just shall live by faith. And okay. For the anger of Elohim is unveiled from heaven against all the wickedness and injustice performed by people who use injustice to suppress the truth. What can be known of Elohim, you see, is plain to them, since Elohim has made it plain to them. There are, of course, things about Elohim which you can't see, namely his eternal power. But ever since the world was created, they have been known and seen in the things that he has made. As a result, they have no excuse. They knew Elohim, but didn't honor him as Elohim or thank him. Instead, they learned to think in useless ways, and their unwise heart grew dark. They declared themselves to be wise, but in fact, they became foolish. They swapped the glory of the immortal Elohim for the likeness of the image of mortal humans and of birds, animals, and reptiles. So Elohim gave them up to uncleanness and the desires of their hearts, with the result that they dishonored their bodies among themselves. They swapped Yahweh's truth for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So Elohim gave them up to shameful desires. Even the women, you see, swapped natural sexual practice for unnatural. And the men too abandoned natural sexual relations with women and were inflamed with their lusts for one another. Men performed shameless acts with men and received in themselves the appropriate repayment for their mistaken ways. Moreover, just as they did not see fit to hold on to knowledge of Elohim, Yahweh gave them up to an unfit mind so that they would behave inappropriately. They were filled with all kinds of injustice, wickedness, greed, and evil. They were full of envy, murder, enmity, deceit, and cunning. They became gossips, slanderers, haters of Elohim, arrogant, self-important, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, unwise, unfaithful, unfeeling, uncaring. They know that Elohim has rightly decreed that people who do things like that deserve death. But not only do they do them, they give their approval to people who practice them. Chapter 2. So you have no excuse. Anyone, whoever you are, who sit in judgment, when you judge someone else, you condemn yourself because you who are behaving as a judge are doing the same things. Elohim's judgment falls, we know, in accordance with the truth on those who do such things. But if you judge those who do them and yet do them yourself, do you really suppose that you will escape Yahweh's judgment? Or do you despise the riches of Yahweh's kindness, forbearance, and patience? Don't you know that Yahweh's kindness is meant to bring you to repentance? But by your hard, unrepentant heart, you are building up a store of anger for yourself on the day of anger, the day when Yahweh's just judgment will be unveiled, the Elohim who will repay everyone according to their works. When people patiently do what is good and so pursue the quest for glory and honor and immortality, Elohim will give them the life of the age to come. But when people act out of selfish desire and do not obey the truth, but instead obey injustice, there will be anger and fury. There will be trouble and distress for every single person who does what is wicked, the Jew first, and also equally the Greek. And there will be glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does what is good, the Jew first, and also equally the Greek. Elohim, you see, shows no partiality. Everyone who sinned outside the law, you see, will be judged outside the law. And those who sin from within the law will be judged by means of the law. After all, it isn't those who hear the law who are in the right before Elohim. And that term, in the right, is what you will often find translated as justified. Okay, that's verse 13. So if you use whatever translation you use, it'll either say justified or righteous. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in Elohim's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Okay, so same concept. After all, it isn't those who hear the law who are in the right before Elohim. It's those who do the law who will be declared to be in the right. This is how it works out. Gentiles, in other words, the people of the nations, don't possess the law as their birthright, but whenever they do what the law says, they are a law for themselves, despite not possessing the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their conscience bears witness as well, and their thoughts will run this way and that, sometimes accusing them and sometimes excusing. On the day when, according to the gospel I proclaim, Elohim judges all human secrets through King Yahshua. But supposing you call yourself a Jew, supposing you rest your hope in the law, supposing you celebrate the fact that Yahweh is your Elohim and that you know what he wants, and that by the law's instruction, you can make appropriate moral distinctions. Supposing you believe yourself to be a guide to the blind, a light to people in darkness, a teacher of the foolish, an instructor for children, all because in the law, you possess the outline of knowledge and truth. Well then, if you're going to teach someone else, aren't you going to teach yourself? If you say people shouldn't steal, do you steal? If you say people shouldn't commit adultery, do you commit adultery? If you loathe idols, why do you rob temples? If you boast in the law, do you dishonor Yahweh by breaking the law? If you boast in the law, do you dishonor Elohim by breaking the law? This is what the scripture says. Because of you, Elohim's name is blasphemed among the nations. Circumcision, you see, has real value for people who keep the law. If, however, you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Meanwhile, if uncircumcised people keep the law's requirements, their uncircumcision will be regarded as circumcision, won't it? So people who are by nature uncircumcised, but who fulfill the law, will pass judgment on people like you who possess the letter of the law and circumcision, but who break the law. The Jew isn't the person who appears to be one, you see, nor is circumcision what it appears to be, a matter of physical flesh. The Jew is the one in secret, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, in the spirit rather than the letter. Such a person gets praise not from humans, but from Elohim. Chapter 3. What advantage then does the Jew possess? What indeed is the point of circumcision? A great deal in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with Yahweh's oracles. What follows from that? If some of them were unfaithful to their commission, does their unfaithfulness nullify Yahweh's faithfulness? Certainly not. Let Elohim be true and every human being false, as the scripture says, so that you may be found in the right in what you say and may win the victory when you come to court. But if our being in the wrong proves that Yahweh is in the right, what are we going to say? That Elohim is unjust to inflict anger on people? I'm reducing things to a human scale. Certainly not. How then could Yahweh judge the world? But if Yahweh's truthfulness grows all the greater and brings him glory in and through my falsehood, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil so that good may come, as some people blasphemously say about us, and as some allege that we say? People like that at least deserve the judgment they get. What then? Are we in fact better off? No, certainly not. I've already laid down this charge, you see. Jews as well as Greeks are all under the power of sin. This is what the scriptures say. No one is in the right, nobody at all. No one understands or goes looking for Elohim. All of them alike have wandered astray. Together they have all become futile. None of them behaves kindly. No, not one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The poison of vipers is under their lips. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are quick when there's blood to be shed. Disaster and wretchedness are in their paths, and they did not know the way of peace. They have no fear of Elohim before their eyes. Now, we know that whatever the law says, it is speaking to those who are in the law. The purpose of this is that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be brought to the bar of Yahweh's judgment. No mere mortal, you see, can be declared to be in the right before Yahweh on the basis of the works of the law. What you get through the law is the knowledge of sin. But now, quite apart from the law, though the law and the prophets bore witness to it, Yahweh's covenant justice, his righteousness, has been displayed. Yahweh's covenant justice comes into operation through the faithfulness of Yahshua the Messiah, for the benefit of all who have faith. For there is no distinction. All sinned and fell short of Yahweh's glory. And by Yahweh's grace, they are freely declared to be in the right, to be members of the covenant through the redemption which is found in the Messiah Yahshua. And by Yahweh's grace, they are freely declared to be in the right, to be members of the covenant through the redemption which is found in the Messiah Yahshua. Yahweh put Yahshua forth as the place of mercy through faithfulness by means of his blood. He did this to demonstrate his covenant justice, his righteousness, because of the passing over in eternal forbearance of sins committed beforehand. This was to demonstrate his covenant justice in the present time. That is, that he himself is in the right, and that he declares to be in the right everyone who trusts in the faithfulness of Yahshua. So what happens to boasting? It is ruled out. Through what sort of law? The law of works? No, through the law of faith. We calculate, we reckon, you see, that a person is declared to be in the right on the basis of faith, apart from the works of the law. Or does Elohim only belong to Jews? Doesn't he belong to the nations as well? Yes, of course, to the nations as well, since Yahweh is one. He will make the declaration in the right over the circumcised on the basis of faith and over the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then abolish the law through faith? Certainly not. Rather, we establish the law. Chapter 4. What shall we say then? Have we found Abraham to be our ancestor in a human fleshly sense? After all, if Abraham was reckoned in the right on the basis of works, he has grounds to boast, but not in Elohim's presence. So what does the Bible say? What does the scripture say? Abraham believed Yahweh, and it was calculated in his favor, putting him in the right. And most traditional translations say, Abraham believed Elohim, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's what you'll see. And this does the same thing. It's just sort of translating or amplifying it, as any of these scriptures, these verses are doing, is they're amplifying or giving you the idiomatic sense of what's being described. And it was Abraham believed Elohim, and it was calculated in its favor, putting him in the right. Now, when someone works, the reward they get is not calculated on the basis of generosity, but on the basis of what they are owed. But if someone doesn't work, but simply believes in the one who declares the unrighteous to be in the right, that person's faith is calculated in their favor, putting them in the right. We see the same thing when David speaks of the blessing that comes to someone when Yahweh calculates to be in the right apart from works. Blessed are those whose law breaking is forgiven and whose sins have been covered over. Blessed is the man to whom Yahweh will not calculate or impute sin. So then, does this blessing come on circumcised people or on uncircumcised? This is the passage we quoted. His faith was calculated to Abraham as indicating that he was in the right. How is it calculated? When he was circumcised or when he was uncircumcised? It wasn't when he was circumcised. It was when he was uncircumcised. He received circumcision as a sign and seal of the status of covenant membership on the basis of faith, which he had when he was still uncircumcised. This was so that he could be the father of all who believe, even when uncircumcised, so that the status of covenant membership can be calculated to their account as well. He is also, of course, the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who follow the steps of the faith which Abraham possessed while still uncircumcised. The promise, you see, didn't come to Abraham or to his family through the law. The promise, that is, that he would inherit the world, it came through the covenant justice of faith. For if those who belong to the law are going to inherit, then faith is empty, and the promise has been abolished. For the law stirs up Yahweh's anger, but where there is no law, there's no law breaking. That's why it's by faith, so that it can be in accordance with grace, and so that the promise can thereby be validated for the entire family, not simply those who are from the law, but those who share the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. Just as the scripture says, I have made you the father of many nations. In fact, that's what his name means, Avraham, father of multitudes. This happened in the presence of the Elohim in whom he believed, the Elohim who gives life to the dead and calls into existence things that do not exist. Against all hope, but still in hope, Abraham believed that he would become the father of many nations, in line with what had been said to him. That is what your family will be like. He didn't become weak in faith as he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and the lifelessness of Sarah's womb. He didn't waver in unbelief when faced with Yahweh's promise. Instead, he grew strong in faith and gave glory to Yahweh, being fully convinced that Yahweh had the power to accomplish what he had promised. That is why it was calculated to him in terms of covenant justice. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. But it wasn't written for him alone that it was calculated to him. It was written for us as well. It will be calculated to us too, since we believe in the one who raised from the dead, Yahshua, our sovereign, who was handed over because of our trespasses and raised because of our justification. That's a mouthful. That's a mouthful, right? Now, let me ask you, when I read these things, the way that I do with the inflection, everything, do things make a little bit more sense, right? And in a translation like this, I hope so. It helps me as well, because I see the big picture. Here's what happens a lot of times, not just with, the letter to the Romans, particularly with a letter like the one to the Romans, because it's so dense and chock full of all kinds of doctrinal things, right? But what oftentimes happens is when you start looking at those passages, people will take specific, verses or 2 or 3 verses, and then they'll sort of pull them into a sermon, or they'll pull them into a study or some type of a message, and you don't get the entire sense, right? So you're kind of left clueless as to, okay, well, that's kind of nice, but you don't really know what it means, right? I like to look to the human beings in the room, but I better keep my face forward. I'm going to keep looking like this. You're going to get my profile all the time. So this is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned last week, I try to read entire books, or at least entire chapters or sections of books, so that you can get the broader sense, the context of what's being spoken. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift over to a more traditional translation. And I'll jump back and forth in the course of the study to the Kingdom translation and the Kingdom New Testament, and we will just kind of compare and see where we're going with all this. So let's turn to Romans 1, and I'm going to go to an NIV, which is still a sort of modern translation. And actually, I'll tell you what I want to do. I want to go to an NASB. It's not as readable as the NIV. I'll be hopping around from place to place, so I'll leave the NIV up there, and I'll just open up a second version, a second text with the NASB, the New American Standard Bible, which tends to be a little bit more true to the Hebrew and Greek texts. So let's turn back to Romans 1, and let's start going through this in a deeper sense here. So Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Yahshua, called an apostle, and you'll notice that this word here is in italics. You see that? Do you also see that down below in the section where this is sort of an interlinear, right? It's not technically interlinear because interlinear Bibles would have the Greek and the Hebrew interspersed between the verses themselves, but it's in effect a sort of an interlinear because you go onto you put your cursor on a word and look at the bottom. You see it says doulos, right? I can't go down because it'll take away the word, but if you go down to the bottom left and the center, you see doulos, right? So they give you the word, the original word in the lower left, and the number, the Strong's Concordance number, and therefore the Brown Driver Biggs number, G1401, doulos, and then it gives you the sense down at the bottom, doulos, slave, servant, right? But then if you look at a word like that as here, you see that as is not translated at the bottom. You see that? Because it doesn't exist. It's interspersed by the translator as a judgment call, and there's nothing wrong with that. You see that all throughout the scriptures in the translation, that you're going to have the translators doing that, and sometimes they'll explain what they did and sometimes they won't, and just leave it to your understanding to know what they did. I don't particularly agree with that one, because it's really, he's called an apostle, not called as an apostle. He was actually called an apostle. Doesn't really matter either way. It's no big deal. But I just wanted to point it out that you have to see things like that, because sometimes it doesn't make a whole lot of difference, like in this case, but sometimes it makes all the difference. Just that one word or two words that are inserted into the text. So you always got to be aware of that. And that's why it's a good idea to go to 2 or 3 different translations. Okay. And I'm sure the translator has reasons for that, and it may be in the grammatical sense in which that's put apart. Okay. So he says, Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Yahshua, called as an apostle or called an apostle. An apostle is an emissary. It's someone who's sent out as an ambassador, if you will, for a particular mission or a particular function. And in effect, the apostles, as apostles, unless they were specifically called like Paul was, there were very specific requirements for apostleship. And you see that listed in the book of Acts. They had to be people who actually walked with Yahshua. They had to be with him from the beginning, right? So unless Paul was a special case because he was specifically designated an apostle directly from the Messiah on the road to Damascus, he was called apart for a specific mission to the Gentiles, which is very important for this book, in fact. And we'll talk about that as we get to it. But Paul was an apostle because he was sent out, and he was on a very specific mission, set apart for the gospel of Elohim. This word, well, set apart, of course, he was separated, divided specifically for this purpose, and it was for the gospel of Elohim. The word is evangelion, which means good news. So, what is this gospel of Elohim? Well, we'll come back to that, but I want to go a little bit further into the text before we go into the term gospel. I've explained this, but now that we're in Romans, I'm going to explain it in its context. Set apart. So he was set apart for this gospel, for this good news of Elohim, whatever that is. And as we're going to see, the whatever that is crucial, because that is precisely the message that he's bringing forth in the book of Romans. He's bringing forth the gospel message, which, as I indicated in the promotional material, is Yahweh's plan to save the world. The good news message is the message of Yahweh's plan to save the world. What is that plan? That plan is the plan that Paul describes, and he begins that description in these first 4 chapters of the book of Romans. And in effect, what it is a new world that's going to exist, a new creation, as you've heard me refer to it over and over in the past several months. A new creation. We see it, the culmination of the message of the first several chapters of Romans in chapter 8, where it talks about all of creation that's awaiting new creation. Why does it have to be new creation? Because the creation that originally existed was corrupted in the Garden of Eden. And since that time has faced literally thousands of years of corruption. And the entire creation awaits renewal. So if you don't like the term new creation, renewed creation, if you will, a creation that is restored. So we can rejoice because Yahweh's plan for mankind doesn't involve Hollywood, right? It doesn't involve worldwide apocalypse, like you see in all kinds of movies where the whole world is destroyed. Far from it. Mankind can never destroy the world that it didn't create. Mankind doesn't have any say in that. Yahweh's the one who decides what happens with his creation. It's his creation. There's nothing that mankind can do that can destroy Yahweh's creation. Yeah, he can mess it up significantly, as he has over the past several thousand years, right? But he can't destroy it. So no, let's clarify a few things very, very simply and very clearly. No, there will not be a nuclear apocalypse that destroys the world. No, mankind is not going to destroy the world through environmental cataclysms and climate change and all those things. I'm not trying to get political here. I'm just telling you, I don't get worked up about those kinds of things because it is antithetic to what the scripture says. This is Yahweh's creation. I believe we have a responsibility to do what we can to be good stewards of that. So I'm not saying I'm against, environmental goals and conservation and all those things. I'm totally for those things. Not to the extreme to which some take it, but I'm totally for those things. Why? Because we are caretakers of Yahweh's earth. I better care about those things. You better care about those things. Because Almighty Yahweh wants us to be stewards of his earth, because he created us to be co-regents, if you will, to steward his creation and to watch over it and to care for it. And if we doubt that, all we got to do is go right back to the beginning, to Genesis, and we'll see that Yahweh put us on the earth for that purpose. And it's as part of that purpose, the bigger purpose of reflecting his glory to the earth. More on that in a little bit. But that gospel message is Yahweh's salvation message to the entire world. It is renewal of creation, beginning with his prime creation, which is humanity. Human beings who were created to be in his image, to reflect his glory throughout the earth. That's why new creation began with that. It began with Yahshua Messiah, who is the perfect man, if you will, the perfect representative of man. And it's interesting because you look at what Pilate says, and let's turn there for just a moment. And I'm going off at a few tangents here, but I promise you that it's all relevant. So let's turn to John 19 for just a moment. What does Pilate say when he sees Yahshua come into the room? And I'll just go to an NIV. I'll just go to an NIV here. John 19:4. Once more, Pilate came out, this Pontius Pilate, the governor, the procurator of Judea, and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Yahshua came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." And you'll see that the older versions will say, "Behold the man." Ecce homo. Behold the man. Well, Pilate didn't know it, but as usual, Almighty Yahweh, through the lips of any of his servants, and it's particularly ironic and poignant to me when he does it through a pagan, He uses the mouth of a pagan to speak truth, whether he realizes it or not. Behold the man, look at the man. Here is the man, the perfect man. He wasn't, of course, he's not thinking that, right? Doesn't matter what he's thinking, it's what he's saying. He is, in effect, prophesying. Behold, here is the man. In other words, this is the example, the exemplary man, the quintessential man. This is the second Adam. The first one messed things up by his disobedience. But this one is the quintessential man who is going to fulfill everything I ever intended for a man to do as my representative, to give honor and glory to me, you see. This is the one that we're supposed to imitate. This is the one who we're supposed to emulate. Let's go back to the text. So the gospel message, my friends, is the message of new creation, beginning with Yahshua's death and resurrection. He fulfilled what a man should be, to be an image bearer of Almighty Yahweh. He put down death through the resurrection, and he began the process of new creation through his establishment of Yahweh's kingdom as he rises from the dead. And as he is new creation, as we see in 2 Corinthians 5. If anyone, just like any of us, when we are in Messiah, new creation. And following that initial primary example is going to be the creation of the entire world, the recreation, the renewal of the entire world. So the world that you see, the beautiful world that you see, sometimes there are folks out there who, the mentality, because we've been so infused, we as a society, we as a world have been so infused with the idea of quote unquote going to heaven, which is not a scriptural idea. We've been so infused with that concept, which is the Platonic, Plato, Greek, and Plutarch and other Greek ideas. We've been so infused with that idea, which has been substituted for the biblical idea of this new creation, of renewal of heaven and earth. We've been so filled with that many people, despite themselves, many religious people have the idea that, well, this earth, it's going to go all to waste anyway. So there's really no worry ultimately that we have to have about this, because we're all going to go off to heaven. And nothing could be further from the truth. What the scriptures describes is a renewed heaven and earth, and even more accurately, a connection, a nexus between heaven and earth, with mankind as the image bearer of Almighty Yahweh, glorifying him throughout the earth. And this gospel message that Paul brought out was alluding to that and directly pointing to that, because he's going to talk about a grander scheme for all of mankind, all of humankind. So he's not approaching it from the perspective necessarily of the individual, although the individual is also going to be considered here, as we'll see. But he's talking about Jew and Gentile, the entire world, all of humanity, that's going to be united under the banner of Almighty Yahweh as image bearers, as fellow image bearers. And I'm just kind of giving you a bird's eye view, and then we're going to kind of dive into this. So what he's saying throughout this entire book, especially in the primary chapters, is that this distinction that exists, and it existed in the first century Common Era, and it continues to the present day, sadly, this distinction between Jew and Gentile. Well, we're Jews, so we do things this way. And we're Gentiles, and we don't do that, and we do things this way. It's a false dichotomy that should not exist any longer. This is why, from a religious standpoint, there have been people I've seen, I don't want to say I've seen everything, but I've been in this walk now for over 30 years. And I've seen all kinds of doctrines come and go, and all kinds of pet projects and pet peeves from people. And you see it. And sometimes the same idea rears its ugly head 10 years later. Someone else brings it. They think they have the brilliant idea. I'm also a government employee, so I also see it in government, right? Somebody does a presentation on how they're going to change the grand scheme of government. And then 20 years later, you can pull out the same PowerPoint. You could change a few of the names and titles in the slide, and you can use the same exact thing 20 years later. And I don't mean to be so cynical, but I promise you that it's true. There's nothing new under the sun, and that goes for religion as well. So you'll have the same rehashed, rewarmed doctrines that will come up 10, 20 years later, and people think they're brilliant. I know one that's ever thought of this before. No, trust me, they thought of it. And you'll see these kind of things. And one of the things that I've seen is this idea that we all have to somehow claim our heritage from Israel in order to be considered part of the faith. So people will go through all kinds of lengths to prove, well, I descended from the line of Reuben, I descended from Naphtali, and and I'm this and I'm that. And there's this, and then there's another line from that, another branch of that says, well, we all got to look like Jews. So we all got to go now and we got to start putting on the talit. That was one of the things that became very problematic in one organization that I was in, that it eventually led to a split. So I kid you not about the seriousness of some of these doctrines. Or we got to wear, the side curls, or we got to dress with black, or we got to dress with white, or we got to wear the hat, the kippah. We don't want to wear the hat, and all kinds of variations and permutations from it. And what I'm saying to you, my friends, is that none of that is necessary. Because what Paul is trying to say through the book of Romans and Galatians and other places is that distinction between Jew and Greek no longer exists. Because we all, through our faith in Yahshua the Messiah, fall under Yahweh's banner for what he is trying to accomplish for humankind. So that's kind of the big picture where we're going here. And any distinction that people try to make is a distinction that is only causing division among the people of Yahweh. It's causing division among humanity, and it's something that's going to lead to not good things. So, let's just look at one other passage here before I continue in Romans. So if you go over to Ephesians 2, he's speaking to the Ephesians, and he says in verse 11, therefore, and by the way, let me bring this up too, because I don't want to be misunderstood, because he brings it up. Paul, is there any advantage to one having been a Jew for one having had the Torah? Of course. And he's going to describe that, but not in the way that people think it, that you have to claim your lineage back to the Jewish people, or you got to prove that I'm descended from the 10 lost tribes or something of that nature, and all kinds of permutations of that. That is not necessary. Ephesians 2 verse 11. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles, the term Gentile is a generic term referring to one of the nations. So sometimes you see it depending on the translation, Gentile, sometimes you'll see nations or one of the nations. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision. So that argument was being had, especially in Paul's day, which is done in the body by, and notice here, you Gentiles, he's referring to the Gentiles here, you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, in other words, Jews, which is done in the body by human hands, he puts parenthetically. And that's important because that distinction is an irrelevant distinction. Remember that at that time, you were separate from Messiah. There was a time when you were separate from Messiah before he did what he did. Excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise. So actually, Ephesians 2, although I didn't plan to bring it up today, is absolutely a beautiful preface to what we're going to cover in Romans, because it tells the exact same message. Remember that at that time, you were separate from Messiah, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise. You are a foreigner to the covenant. You weren't part of the promise before Messiah. Without hope and without Elohim in the world. He doesn't go into this, but the best that you could do, according to the way that Judaism tended to view Gentiles, is that you could obey what's known as the Noahide laws. And as long as you're a good person, an Elohim fearer, which is the way it's termed in the book of Acts, maybe you had a chance. But in terms of being part of the covenant, no way. You were without hope and without Elohim in the world, pretty much left to your own devices. But now in Messiah Yahshua, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. That is the message of Romans. The book of Romans is giving you this message about that removal of a distinction between Jew and Gentile and a uniting of all people through Yahshua the Messiah because of what he did. And it's describing the nature of Elohim, the character of Elohim, all throughout the book. And I wish we had time to go through the whole letter, but we simply don't. or we could always do it in segments as time goes on. But continuing here in Ephesians 2:14, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one. He himself, who's that? Yahshua. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, Jew and Gentile, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. The law of Yahweh, the Torah? No. This is a point of departure that I have with folks, including N.T. Wright, who bring about the teachings about the Torah. But I'm not going to go deeply into that today because it's beyond the scope of this study. Okay? I have explained not too long ago, as a matter of fact, I showed you that this specific thing was referring to an actual inscription that was found in the temple precincts that had writing explaining that if you were a Gentile, this is as far as you could go into the temple. You couldn't go any deeper into the precincts of the temple because that was reserved for Jews. So if you were a Gentile, this is as far as you can go. And if you go even further, any further than this, you could be given a death penalty because you're crossing into sacred territory, so to speak. And Paul says, no, I don't think so. Yahshua set aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. The Torah? No. That oral tradition that existed, that was encapsulated in that barrier that existed, a literal barrier that existed. And he said his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two. Do you see that? His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, reconciliation, peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to Elohim through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. This is exactly what the message of Romans is. Yahshua, he came and preached peace to you who are far away and peace to those who are near. Peace to you who are far away. Who are those? The Gentiles. And peace to those who are near. Who are those? The Jews. For through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, Gentiles, but fellow citizens with Yahweh's people and also members of his household, which you weren't before, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Messiah Yahshua himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in Yahweh. And in him, you too, Gentiles, are being built together to become a dwelling which Yahweh lives by his Spirit. For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Messiah Yahshua, for the sake of you Gentiles, notice, for this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Messiah Yahshua, for the sake of you Gentiles. Isn't this what he says in Romans? Except he puts it a little bit differently. He calls himself a bondservant. Well, a prisoner is the bondservant, but this word doulos it can refer to any kind of a prisoner, like an indentured servant, if you will. But same message. Paul, by the way, when I changed over to that tab, did it change over to the tab? Okay. Paul, a bondservant of Messiah Yahshua, called an apostle, set apart for the gospel of Yahweh, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. And he goes on speaking from there. And he says down verse 5, to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake, among whom you also are the called of Yahshua Messiah. We'll come back to that. Back to Ephesians very quickly. So he says, for this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Messiah Yahshua, for the sake of you Gentiles. And then he goes and he describes other things in Ephesians. Okay. So keep that message in mind as we continue going through the book of Romans. So back to Romans 1:1. So a bondservant of Messiah Yahshua, called an apostle, set apart for the gospel of Elohim. So in Ephesians, Paul is saying that Yahshua, right? He says he preached peace, verse 17. I thought we were done with Ephesians 2, but we're not. 2:17, he came and preached peace. He who? He, Yahshua. He came and preached peace to you who are far away. What is peace? And peace to those who are near. Peace is shalom, right? Irene, the name Irene, it means peace. This is where it comes from. Irene, right? It's the equivalent of shalom. And the word shalom has to do with being whole, being complete. He preached peace. If you have two people that are apart from one another, you bring reconciliation. Right? So another term you can use here is reconciliation. He preached reconciliation. He says that in verse 16, in one body, what body? His, to reconcile both of them, both who? Jew and Gentile, to Elohim through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. There was hostility between them. Why? Because of these rules and regulations that was dividing them. Was that the Torah? I don't think so. Like I said, that's beyond the scope today. I think that there were oral traditions and oral laws that were dividing, but is there a way in which people were viewing even the regular Torah? In other words, the written Torah that was also causing enmity? Yes, because of people's interpretations of that law. So we're going to come back to that later. So when he talks about Torah, when he talks about law in Romans, he's not just, in my opinion, not just talking about the oral law. He's also referring to the written law as well, but it's not as clear cut as people would see. Oh, written law, therefore it's all done. No, it's the way that people were interpreting the written law, because all oral tradition interprets the written law. In some way, they look at the law and they say, okay, this is how you keep that. You do it yourself. The way that you keep the Sabbath is an oral tradition. I hate to break it to you, but it is. Because I'm going to tell you right now, some of you cook on the Sabbath. I don't cook on the Sabbath. I'm not saying that I'm bad and you're good. The other way around, that you're bad and I'm good because of that. But it's true. Some of you cook on the Sabbath and I don't. I heat stuff up in the microwave in the Sabbath. Some of you don't. Some of you think, oh, I'm not going to do any kind of hot food or warm food in the Sabbath, right? Some of you take a long walk on the Sabbath. And some of you say, I'm not going to go beyond my environment here. Some of you say, I let my children play on the Sabbath. And others of you say, no, I try to occupy their minds with other things on the Sabbath. And I can give you a dozen other examples of how every single one of you, and me included, how we'd create oral law with regard to the Torah. Right? I don't want to go, like I said, I shouldn't go into this deeply, but it's important to understand that when Paul is talking about the Torah, about the law in Romans, he's referring not just to the oral Torah, which I think is the term specifically works of the law. I think it has to do with the oral traditions. Okay? And I've explained many times in recent days why I believe that. But not everywhere that he talks about the law is he talking about just oral traditions, because there are places where it doesn't make sense, because in Romans 7 and in Romans 8, he makes reference to the written Torah. So we can't just dismiss every reference to the law as oral tradition. It's not. However, you have to look at everything with the context of Paul being a Pharisee. And when he talks about the law, he's talking about everything that goes with it, including the oral interpretations of the law, just like you have interpretations about how to keep the Sabbath or about other things that you do. So that discussion, we're going to have to leave completely for its own discussion for another day. But point here, in one body, he reconciles, he brings peace to them, because this constant thing, well, I'm a Jew and you're a Gentile and you're dirty and you have no part in what we do. That can't exist. And then the Gentile thing that hates Jews, anti-Semitic behavior and spirit that is stoked by the adversary to continue to create that enmity. You see, there's enough hatred to go around. There's enough division to go around. There's enough exclusivity and elitist thinking to go around on the side of both Jew and Gentile. So nobody is scot-free from that. And a lot more to say about that as we talk about chapter 2, which I haven't even gotten past 1 yet, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it. All right. So he came and preached peace, reconciliation to Gentile far away and to Jew near. And through him, we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Okay, let's go back to Romans, Romans 1. But just remember that verse 16, that 17, Ephesians 2:17, he, Yahshua, came and preached peace, right? So we go back to Romans. And I want to pause here, and I want to take you to, because, referring to the gospel of Elohim, that gospel message, evangelion, good news. So let's go over to, and I'll stay in the NIV for now. Let's go over to Isaiah 52, because when he talks about the gospel message, he's really talking about the message that's brought forth going from running roughly from Isaiah 40 to Isaiah 55, that long beautiful poem that exists that talks about the servant songs, right? Isaiah 40 to 55. So in Isaiah 40, he starts talking about that message, which John the Baptist is a forerunner, similar to others who do the same to prepare the way for Messiah. But notice verse 7 here, Isaiah 52, verse 7, which is sort of a nice culmination of everything. It says, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. What is that good news? Good news, that's the Greek equivalent of that is euangelion, evangel, gospel. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. Why is this beautiful? Because this is what they're doing, who proclaim peace, right? So Yahshua in Ephesians 2:17, he came and preached peace to you who are far away. He's the first one who begins to preach it, right? I mean, he's not the first one who begins to preach it because John was doing it as well. But I'm saying he's the one who modeled it for us. But that is what this message is about. It's about preaching, proclaiming peace. Who brings good tidings, glad tidings, same thing. Who proclaim what? Salvation. Look at the word at the bottom there. Yeshua, right? Who say to Zion, your Elohim reigns, the kingdom. Your Elohim is king. Your Elohim, Zion, is king. Listen, your watchmen lift up their voices. Together they shout for joy. When Yahweh returns to Zion, they will see it with their own eyes. Burst into songs of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem. For Yahweh has comforted his people, which is what you see in Isaiah. It's an allusion to Isaiah 40. Comfort ye, my people. Yahweh has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. Yahweh will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of what? Of all the nations, the Gentiles, and all the ends of the earth. All the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our Elohim. And he goes on and he speaks more from there, right? So this is the message. This is the gospel that Paul is so proud of. This plan of salvation for all the world, which he promised, he set apart for the gospel, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Where? In places like you just saw, because in Isaiah, concerning his son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh. And this word is descendant, sperma. In the Greek, sperma is seed, the offspring, right? You know the word sperm. What is that? That's man's seed, right? This is where the word sperm comes from, right? He's born of a descendant, but it's used not only in the sense of the raw material from which a human being is made, but it's used because of the fact that a human being comes from that. It's used to describe a descendant. So if you hold your place there, so he was born of a descendant according to the flesh. So he says, which he promised, the gospel, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his son. So we saw in Isaiah one area, but we can also go to 2 Samuel 7. And 2 Samuel 7, the setting of 2 Samuel 7 is Nathan the prophet. He is speaking with King David, and David is considering building a house for Yahweh. He's considering building the temple. And of course, Yahweh says, I appreciate what you're trying to do, David, but you're not going to be the one to build it for me for a number of reasons. Your son will do it, right? But here's what he says. Here's the nice thing that he says to David, which is rather fascinating. He says, down in verse 12 to David. So he says to David, in effect, David, I'm flattered, but you're not going to build me a house. You know what, David? I'm going to build you a house. It's a play on words, right? David is talking about a physical house, a temple, right? But Yahweh is saying, David, I appreciate that, but guess what? You want to build me a house? Sit back. I'm going to build you a house. Because you've been a faithful servant, I'm going to raise your seed. So he says in verse 12, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish what? His kingdom. I will raise up your offspring. The word is zera, which is equivalent to the Greek word sperma. So when you go and you look at the Greek version of the scriptures, which is the Septuagint, which was created in Alexandria, Egypt for Greek-speaking Jews, the term there is going to be sperm. It's going to be related to sperm. I don't know the exact terminology, but it's if I'm not mistaken, it says something like sperma. I will raise up your offspring. You know what? I don't want to guess. Let me see if I can find a Septuagint translation of this because I want you to see this. Okay, I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna be able to find a quick. I thought I could find a quick online version, but the bottom line is the terminology that it uses here it uses the term, and I don't remember the form that it uses, but it uses the term anastasis, which is the term, if you've ever seen or heard, if you ever heard of Anastasia, right? The Greek name is a female name, Anastasia. It means resurrection. Okay. So when you look at the text here in the Septuagint, hey, sweetheart, when you see the text and it says in 2 Samuel 7, verse 12, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. Most people, until Yahshua, would have read that and read it like at a very literal, superficial level. I will raise up your offspring. I will, in other words, whoever your descendant is, I'm going to raise up that descendant, whether it be Solomon or whomever it would be later on the throne, that comes from the line of Judah, and I will raise that person to serve as king. But we know that it can't be just that, because David's kingdom was to be established forever. And there is no Jewish king, and hasn't been for quite some time. So it has to mean more than that. So when Yahshua resurrected, his disciples would have gone back to this verse and looked at it in the Greek version, and they, not even the Greek, it would have been in the Hebrew as well, but the Greek is very clear because it talks about sperma anastasis, or some version of that, your seed. And they saw it not just as anastasis, as raising up in the sense of, I'm going to bring this person up to, to someday raise them to kingship, but literally resurrected. I'm going to resurrect your offspring. I'm going to resurrect your seed, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom, which is entirely consistent with the Isaiah message proclaiming the kingship of this person who was going to bring peace between Jew and Gentile. So there's so much that's going on here. So, and I want you to see how all these things hook and eye together. Okay. So let's go back to Romans 1. So concerning his son who was born of a descendant according to the flesh. Well, what's that? That's a reference, I believe, to 2 Samuel 7 and other places, who was declared the son of Yahweh with power by the resurrection from the dead. And there's no way I can cover all this, right? Because it's just, I'd have to go minutely into every verse, but there are all sorts of nuances going on here that I want you to understand that's happening. According to the Spirit of holiness, Yahshua Messiah, our master, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles, that's his mission, for his name's sake, among whom you also, Romans, are the called of Yahshua Messiah. In other words, you too are called to be separate, to be his servants, right? To all who are beloved of Yahweh in Rome, called, again, you have this as in here, called as saints? I don't think so. Called saints. You're called saints. You're referred to as holy ones, as ones that are separate for Yahweh's service. Grace, this is all just the introduction, right? Grace to you and peace from Yahweh our Father and the Master Yahshua Messiah. Then he says, first, I thank my Elohim through Yahshua Messiah for you all. So these are the normal things you would say in an introductory letter. He had not been to Rome, by the way. I thank my Elohim through Yahshua Messiah, for you all, because your faith, Romans, is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. Of course, it would be because he's in Rome, right? And Rome is the center of the known world. For Yahweh, whom I serve in my spirit, so he's giving something of his credentials, right? Whom I serve in my spirit in the preaching of the gospel of his son, which is what we just saw, is my witness, Yahweh is my witness, as to how unceasingly I make mention of you, as always in my prayers, always in my prayers making requests, if perhaps now at last by the will of Yahweh, I may succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, so that I may impart some spiritual gift to you, that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you, while among you, each of us by each other's faith, both yours and mine. So he says, I want to get to you. And, I've tried to do it for a while. Well, he didn't say that yet. He says, I want to come to you because I want to encourage you, right? Just like I'm doing other places. I want to encourage you. And I also feel certain that I'm going to be encouraged by you as well, because faith encourages faith, right? Just like iron sharpens iron, faith encourages faith. Verse 13, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I've planned to come to you. I want to make sure you understand. I've been trying to get to you, and I've been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. In other words, I've been having great success in many other places, and I want to have that same success with you. But something always keeps coming up. Something keeps blocking my way. And then he says something interesting. He says, I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. What's this wise and foolish part stuff? Wise would have been considered the Jews, right? And the foolish would be considered the Gentiles. It's a cultural thing that's going on. And he's not speaking as if he believes, okay, you are wise and the rest of you are fools. He's speaking in terms of the way that they would speak. I'm under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. And there are reasons why I say he's calling one wise and the other foolish, because you see it in other places. So for my part, so in other words, he's saying, I'm under obligation to both of you. I don't make an exception of persons, right? I preach to both Jew and to Gentile. In fact, he goes on to say how he will, when he goes places, he speaks to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. So he's under obligation to both, and that's his pattern. If you go to the book of Acts, you see that he will go first to a synagogue, and he will speak to the Jew and to the Elohim fearers who were there, who were Gentiles. But he says, I'm under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians. What's this barbarian thing? Well, we have a certain connotation in our culture because of history. It's not really referring to those barbarians in that sense. It's referring to Greeks and barbarians. It's kind of like a generic term speaking about one another, right? It's like it's barbarians is anyone who's not a Jew. The term barbarian has to do like anyone who they don't speak a language that everyone else can understand, right? Because the Greeks thought they were very cultured in their language, and that their language is pristine. And then you have everyone else who speaks ba, 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 like a baby, right? That's where it comes from, the word barbarian. The people who are like Baba speakers, okay? So in other words, I'm under obligation to Greeks and to barbarians, in other words, to Greeks and to everyone else who is not Greek, right? Both to the wise Jew and to the foolish Gentile. So for my part, I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. And then critical verses here, right? For I am not ashamed of the gospel. He wants to make sure that they understand that he's actually quite proud, but he says it in a different way. And there are reasons for that I can't go into right now. So why does he say it? For I am not ashamed of the gospel. Well, it's allusions to other things that I won't go into. For it is the power of Yahweh for salvation to everyone who believes. It is the power of Yahweh for salvation. Yahweh's plan to save the world. It is the power of Yahweh for salvation to everyone who believes. So he's already stating the centrality of his message to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, is he saying necessarily the Jew first, like in primacy? Like, the Jews got a bigger level of importance and then the Greek just kind of left over? That's not what he means. To the Jew first, there's a reason why he's saying to the Jew first. Not because he's saying, okay, Greeks, sit down and take a back seat until we go to the Jews first, and then we'll get to you when they have time. That's not the message here. It's to the Jew first because there's a specific reason, because the message was originally commended to the Jews to bring it out to the Gentiles. And what we're getting to in chapter 2 and moving further into the book is that the Jewish people failed in their responsibility to bring the Gentiles into the faith. More on that later. So the Jew first, like, okay, you're hearing this first because you got to get right first, because it was supposed to start with you and you blew it. Let me just put it into vernacular, right? Into the translation of Carlos, right? You were supposed to do this and you blew it. So then Yahweh, he's going to be true to his word, and he's going to make sure that what he said he was going to fulfill, what he told Abraham that he was going to fulfill, he's going to do it. You didn't do it because you essentially started to do the same things that the ones that you were called to bring into the faith, you were supposed to bring them away from that and bring them into the faith and bring them into the fold. And instead, you were supposed to, okay, I'm finishing my sentence. And instead, you went in their direction. You were supposed to be unleavened and deal with the leavened, and instead you got leavened with the leaven. Shouldn't be that way. you should have been the first ones. And instead you started to act like them. Okay, verse 17. For in it, the gospel, the power of Elohim, the message, for in it, in the gospel, the righteousness, the covenant faithfulness of Yahweh is revealed, okay, from faith to faith. As it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. And that's a reference to places like Habakkuk 2:4. I need you to understand that every time I run across a verse, it wants to lead me to like 5 other verses, right? This is why we spend a lot of time on this. And I say that not to, like excuse keeping you longer. I say it because I actually say, because I want to encourage you. I want you to understand there's so much going on here. It's exciting to me. And I want you to be excited about it too. That's why I bring it up, because it's like, boy, this should be something that we should all just relish to learn this stuff, because there's so much going on here. So he says, for in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of Yahweh is revealed from faith to faith. What does that mean? Well, we'll get to that in a second. As it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. And that's a reference to Habakkuk 2:4. Okay, so I'm going to come back to verse 17. For the wrath of Elohim, verse 18, is revealed from heaven against all wickedness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about Elohim is evident within them. For Yahweh made it evident to them. For Yahweh made it evident to them. In other words, the wrath of Elohim. What is the wrath of Elohim? The wrath of Elohim is his judgment. What is the judgment of Yahweh? The judgment of Yahweh, when we look at wrath, we're so conditioned to look at wrath simply as anger. And there's an element of anger there, to be sure, because when you do something and you're trying to do something righteous and someone does something unjust, don't you get angry? If you do something nice for somebody and they come back and they mistreat you, or they go out and they talk badly about you, or they talk badly about your family, or they do you some wrong after you've treated them with kindness, doesn't that bring anger in you? Don't you want to right that wrong? Don't you want to right that injustice? This is the sense, the feeling that you should get here. Too often, the Almighty is portrayed as a wrathful, angry curmudgeon, right? He sits in heaven waiting to see who he can zap. I'm sorry, people have him confused with Zeus and these other false Elohim who have nothing better to do than sit on Mount Olympus all day and think about the next woman that they're going to seduce. Forgive me for being blunt, but that's what you see in the Greek. That's not Yahweh. Yahweh is not some petty old curmudgeon sitting angry about something and bitter and waiting to see who he can zap. No, this is the picture of an Elohim who hates injustice because he sees the danger that it poses to his creation, who sees what it's already done to his creation, who sees what corruption and perversion and pollution, the things that are going to be described in the next few verses, who sees what those things have done to his creation, including man, especially man. And he's angry about it because he created man to live abundantly. He created man to live forever. And instead, because of sin, everything was turned upside down and chaos was brought in where there was perfection. He's going to want to right that wrong, not just for mankind, but for the entire earth. So that picture of a wrathful Elohim is not an angry, bitter Elohim who's trying to destroy and see what he could do capriciously to hurt people, to break things. He's an Elohim who's a righteous judge who looks at something and he says, this is unjust, this is wrong, and this has to be made right. Let me ask you a question, because I really want you to understand this. I know that you do, but I want to make sure that I drive this point home. We all know, we all see in the news every day the kind of stories where children are murdered, or where rapes occur, and when people are pillaged and all kinds of atrocities are done and all that. You're all okay with that, right? We're good with that, right? Well, I don't know. We must be, because we accuse the Almighty of being I'm not saying we do. I'm making a point. I'm doing like Paul says. I'm speaking about it in human terms now. So 60 million, I don't know what the number's up to now, 60 million unborn children are murdered in the womb since that atrocious Supreme Court decision in the 70s, and continuing and counting. But we're not supposed to be affected by that. We're all supposed to be, well, it is what it is. It's just tissue, you see. Do you see how that kind of stuff, does that have an effect on you? And again, I'm not trying to get political here, but I am going to be very clear-eyed with regard to the word of Yahweh. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with murder. I have a problem with rape and sexual exploitation. I have a problem with the strong bearing down upon the weak. I have a problem with, the rich who should be using their wealth to help and contribute, instead exploiting others. And on we could go. So that desire that we have for things to be put right, I say to myself, I'm not just to make those decisions. I don't think any men are just to make those kind of decisions, except on a very minor level. That's why we have judges and the like, right? But how do I sleep at night? I sleep at night because I say to myself, there's a part of my brain that says, you know what? I know that someone is in charge of all this. I know that even if I can't see it, I know that even if I don't live to see it, I know that someday all of this is going to be made right. I don't know how it's going to happen. I couldn't begin to tell you. The problems are way too big, much higher than my pay grade, right? We all get pretty arrogant sometimes, thinking that we have all the answers and all the solutions, political or otherwise. We do not. But I know that there's one who does. And that's how I sleep at night. That's how I don't wake up every morning with anxiety. That's how I don't go into depression every day, not unable to function in my day-to-day because I'm thinking about all the injustice around me and all the evil around me. That who knows that within a 5-mile radius of my home, there could be all kinds of things that are going on over which I have no control that could put me or my family in danger. I don't even want to know. But I know that there's one who does know. And I know that he would not be Elohim if he did not right those wrongs. And that's what this is talking about. For the wrath of Elohim is revealed from heaven against all wickedness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Because that which is known about Elohim is evident within them. In other words, if they wanted to know all the unjust and all the wicked out there, if they wanted to know Elohim, all they got to do is look. You could see Elohim. People say all the time, and I'm just breaking into little mini sermons here, but people say all the time, where was the Almighty? Where was God on 9/11? That's self-righteousness. Where was God on 9/11? I'll tell you where he was. I'll tell you exactly where Elohim was. He was in the firefighter running into the building. He was into the police officer who died trying to save someone from this place or that place. He was in the thousands of people who helped to evacuate people. Do you know that the evacuation that took place on 9/11 was the largest civilian evacuation by boat since Dunkirk in World War II? Some of you may have seen the movie Dunkirk recently or know about it from history. And do you know that people, to get off the island, there weren't enough ways to get out, and people came fishing boats and this kind of boat. Go look it up when you're done with me. Go Google it. The largest peacetime evacuation in history happened on 9/11. That's where God was. He was in all the doctors and the nurses and the technicians and the caregivers and the people who rebuilt the spot afterwards, and on it could go. We want to look at the wrong places, but he's always there. And how is he working today? He's working through people like that. He's working through his people throughout the earth, who are his hands and his feet. That's you. That's me. So he's saying that if they want to know who he is, they could see it. Elohim made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. We don't know how a baby is formed, but we know how it comes out. That little dude or dudess comes out after 9 months, right? Hopefully, and they are just about perfect. How does that happen? And how many examples can we give of creation? That beautiful tree and flower out there. How does that happen? Right? In the book of Proverbs, there are 4 things that, right, that I don't even know where they come from. And there are 4 things that amaze me. And I'm paraphrasing heavily here, right? We know. And the people who deny it, deep down inside, I think they know too, but they're not going to bring themselves to admit it. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and eternal nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew Elohim, they did not honor him as Elohim or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So this term up here of the wise and the fools, it could also be allusion to that. The people who think they are wise are no fools. Professing to be wise, they became fools. In the book of Proverbs, and unless you think I'm being harsh, the book of Proverbs says the fool says in his heart there is no Elohim. It says it in 2 different Psalms. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible Elohim for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and 4-footed animals and crawling creatures. So what is he talking about? He's talking about idolatry. So idols that are made in the form of men, idols that are made in the form of beasts, of birds, crawling creatures. But it's really more than that. And I explained this, at least I tried to explain this when I gave you a recent study about within the last 6 months about idolatry. I don't know if you remember that, but we think that idolatry is simply bound down to these, metal or stone idols, these wooden things that don't mean anything, right? But those are only the physical representations of idolatry, right? What is behind the idolatry? That is the real problem. That is at the root of the problem. The problem is not the statue, my friends. A statue is just a piece of metal or a piece of stone. This is why Paul says in Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians, that if you're eating a piece of meat that's been sacrificed to an idol, so what? We know that the idol is nothing, he says, but, to keep the peace and make sure that you don't offend anybody and, put a damper of that faith, then if they're not comfortable, don't eat it, right? But he says the idol is nothing. But what is the problem? It is what the idol represents. It is the heart of the matter. It is the wickedness behind the idea. Behind every instance of idolatry is what? It is a recognition, not a recognition, it is a lack of recognition of Yahweh as supreme being and creator. It is in effect saying something else takes Yahweh's glory. So instead of being who we were meant to be as human beings to reflect Yahweh's glory throughout the earth, instead we allow another thing to take his glory, including ourselves. How corrupt and how perverted is that? And every time that we go against his word, we in effect say, and against his plan, we in effect say, we know better than he does. This is the problem I have with a number of the issues of the day. I don't have certain fundamental problems, and I won't go into specifics, but with that, the fact that people look at things a certain way. What I have a problem is the attitude behind it. Is that people don't understand that the ultimate problem with many of these issues is that you are rejecting the one whose glory you're supposed to be promoting. You are in effect saying we can do it better than you can. So you don't. So Yahweh said that I'm going to give you one example, right? And again, I'm not trying to get political, but it's important to make this point, and this is the only way I can make it. Yahweh says a man and a woman for a marriage, and then we turn that upside its head because we know better, because we know better than the word of Yahweh. And that's one example of many that we could turn to, where man basically says, nope, I reject what it says in that scripture. That's just one people's interpretation of God. And there are many ways to God, many ways to the divine, or however you want to put it. And therefore, we can do it any way we want. And that's similar to what Paul is describing here. So he continues and he says, okay, so because of that, Yahweh gave them over. He gave them up. And he said, okay, you want to do it your way? Let's see what that brings you. And then he describes several things, right? Therefore, Elohim gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonor among them. For they exchanged the truth of Yahweh for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And again, I believe that broadly speaking, that is a reference to idolatry. Now, there's some people who are they're gonna latch on to verses 26 and 27, and we're just not gonna go there. But I'm gonna just say a quick thing about it. So for this reason, because I can't ignore it, Elohim gave them over to degrading passions, for the women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way, also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. So clearly there's a description that's going on here about homosexuality, but then that's all that people focus on. And then this becomes all about homosexuality. Stop. There's a bigger issue here. These verses, right? I'm not saying to ignore this. Yes, homosexuality is its own issue entirely. And the only thing I'll say about that at the moment, because we'll be here forever, is that you must not simplify a complex issue. You must not simplify a complex issue. This verse, these two verses here, 26 and 27, cannot be reduced to a soundbite or two. And when you do that, you hurt people, real people, people that are family members, people that are close friends, people that you love, people that I love. I'm not willing to reduce my love for my fellow human beings to ultra interpretations of two verses in scripture that are taken in one context and pulling everything else out of context. So let's just leave it at that for now. Let's stop hurting people and let's figure out a way to love people while still maintaining ourselves true to the word of Yahweh. So that's a discussion for another day. And I'm absolutely willing to have that conversation, but we have to have it intelligently, because I'm not going to have that kind of a conversation with fanaticism, and I'm not going to have it with hatred. There's a real conversation to be had there, but it's a conversation, not, not a law court. Okay. Therefore, Elohim gave them over the lust of their hearts to impurity, etc. So the verses of all of this here, everything from 18 downward, the bigger picture is the idolatry and the attitude of the hearts behind it. This is what Yahshua came to crush. He came to crush the forces of darkness and an injustice, the forces of unrighteousness, the forces of perversion and corruption of everything that Yahweh holds dear and everything that is pure. This is what he sought to eliminate the effects of. So all the forces, and you see this described variously in different places in scripture, in the book of Galatians, for example, where it talks about the elements. This is Galatians 4:3. So also when we were underage, we were not yet mature, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. Do you believe that there are people who say that this was referring to the law of Almighty Yahweh? It's such a corruption and a perversion, has nothing to do with what this means. But when the set time had fully come, Elohim sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, the Jews, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Okay, and it goes on, and I can't get into all that there. But the slavery that we were in under the elemental spiritual forces, that's this. The elemental spiritual forces that are represented today and always have been in what? The social forces that cause us all kinds of grief, the political forces that cause us all kinds of griefs, the economic forces and financial forces that cause us all kinds of grief, all of which are infected with ways of doing things that are in antithesis to the way that Yahweh wants to do things. So Yahweh says, you're going to have a tithe, a 10% tithe that everyone, rich or poor, is going to do across the board. So we come up with 5,000 page tax systems, right? It was funny. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I won't go into the specifics of it. But I was, as I said, I'm a government employee, and I was doing a training session the other day for a federal agency. And a very high-ranking official in that agency, who will remain nameless, said that let's just put it this way, there are certain regulations and things that make it almost impossible for him to get anything done. And I thought to myself, dude, if that's true about you, why are we expecting it of the American people? But that's the way it is, because it's not, and it has nothing to do with him. I'm not knocking him. It's beyond him. It's everything is so complicated anymore. So Yahweh says, let's keep it simple. You want to know when the first day of the month comes? Go outside, farmer, and go look in the field. And go, when you see the moon, when you see the moon that it looks like burnished, like a burnished sword in the sky, boom, there it is, the first of the month. There weren't all this need for calculations and let's go through 50 permutations. And now only the smart people can figure it out because they know how to do the calculations, see. And, by the way, you guys might have it, but the guys who are, 3 towns away will never know because, because it takes, this is in the ancient times. Right now, you could just get on the internet or call somebody. But in those days, how do you get word to people 3 towns down? So innovative people figure out how to do it, right? So they'll say, okay, let's start doing this signaling system that you see in the Lord of the Rings movie, where you go and you do a flame and from town to town. But you know what? If you don't have people like that who find innovative ways to do it, what do you got? Then you get corrupt men who say, okay, we're going to do it this way. We're going to hoard that technology, or we're going to hoard that thing because, hey, we can do it because we know it, but those people down there, they don't need to know it. So so people do unscrupulous things because they get into an attitude of, we're going to keep this knowledge to ourselves. So you have this constant flowing of forces, these elemental. Why elemental? What do we call elements? So when you look at the elements, the natural elements that are the building blocks, right? They're like the building blocks of things. These elemental forces. Why elemental? Because they're primordial, right? They're forces that are like the bare bones forces, the thing that existed in Eden, right? With the serpent. They're elemental spiritual forces, and he identifies them as such. And that's what's being described here. And what happens? You have all this going on in history. And let me tell you something. The Roman times in which Yahshua and the apostles lived was an evil, evil time. I have no way of proving if the evil of their time, relatively speaking to the evil of our time, was the same, different, lesser, but it had to be at least as evil, comparatively speaking, as what we're facing today. And for whatever reason, Yahweh didn't choose this period of time, the 21st century, but he chose that period of time, the first century, in which to send his son. So for whatever reason, Yahweh felt at that point it was enough, that it was representative of the most evil that you can have. And these spiritual forces, in effect, bubbled to the surface to the point where it was almost impossible for people to live. I'm inclined to believe, just as a little side note, parenthetical, that the evil of that day, relatively speaking, was worse than the evil of today. Because today we have so many conveniences of life that we can deal with things a lot better, in my opinion. But back then they had nothing. So in my opinion, it was tougher back then, but be that as it may. But for whatever reason, at that time, those forces it's like they were reaching a crescendo. In music, when you got a crescendo, right? You start slow, softly, and you build it up and build it up, and then it reaches a boom, right? That's what I'm talking about. The elementary spiritual forces, the wickedness that's being described here was raised to a crescendo level. And it's at that point that Yahweh decides to send his son, because something has to be done about it. And the people who were supposed to do something about it, at least to the extent that it was within their power, did not do what they were supposed to do. And instead, they fell prey to it as well. And I'm not saying that with some, overly critical finger. I'm just telling you what happened, because Paul describes it. Okay. If I were there in that period of time, I probably would have come short as well. So it's not a criticism of the Jewish people for not doing what they were supposed to do, but the fact of the matter is that they had a responsibility and a charge, and they did not fulfill it. Israel did not fulfill its prophetic responsibility, but Yahweh had said to Abraham, through you and your seed, all the nations will be blessed. And Yahweh is not a liar, though let every man be considered a liar. But Yahweh was going to fulfill his word, and he did it. Only he didn't do it through the entire nation. He did it through one representative Israelite, one man who would be the new Adam, who would be the Israelite to fulfill exactly what he had said to Abraham that he would do. And that, of course, was Yahshua the Messiah. And that's what I'm getting at. So in effect, what Yahweh decided to do was he waited until things were the darkest in history. Under the Roman Empire, under the crushing weight of this ferocious beast, the likes of which the world has never seen since. That's another reason why I believe that it was worse back then than it is now. There was not a place you could go to in the known world that Rome didn't have its hand in. And Rome was a corrupt power. So he waits, Yahweh, until this crescendo, this peak crescendo of evil and of ugliness and of darkness, when everyone else has given up hope. And it's at that precise moment, when things look worse, is when he says, this is the time. And he sends Yahshua the Messiah. And he doesn't send him, mind you, as a conquering hero, as a physical king who's going to come and destroy everything. He sends him to defeat evil. As corny as this is going to sound, and as cliche as it's going to sound, I promise you that it's true. What does he do? What does he use to defeat this crescendo of evil, of all these primordial forces? How does he defeat them? With violence and with war? Like everyone expected? No. He sends his son and he defeats them and all the forces with love. That's how he defeats it. Because that is the force that overcomes and overshadows all the other things. That is the force that in the face of violence it makes it come to nothing. Because you can hate someone all you want, and in the face of love, it ultimately doesn't even matter. I'll never forget a story. And, you've probably heard stories like this too. There was the preacher, a New York preacher by the name of David Wilkerson. I don't know if you ever heard of him. I didn't agree. He's dead now. I didn't agree with his doctrines, his teachings, and a number of other things. You know, he was viewed by many as a prophet. I didn't agree with that. But I'll never forget, he wrote a book in I think it was in the 70s called The Cross and the Switchblade. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It was a Latino preacher named of Nicky Cruz, and he was converted through the evangelization of David Wilkerson. And I remember that in his book, he talks about one person that he ran into. I don't remember if it was Nicky himself or somebody else. And in effect, these were hardened gang leaders in New York. And he was preaching to the guy in New York, and he said the guy threatened him to cut him up if he got any closer. And I'm butchering the story a bit, but it was something along these lines. And I remember, and it stuck with me. I read this when I was a kid, before I even quote unquote converted and came to the faith when I was a teenager, and it stuck with me to this day. And the guy says to him, you don't get close to me or I'm going to cut you up. And Wilkerson told him, he says, you can cut me into 100 pieces, and every single one of those pieces is going to love you. He said that this hardened gang leader broke down sobbing in tears. And I'm pretty sure it was Nicky Cruz. And eventually he made this profession of faith. Now you may consider that, it's right, it's corny, whatever. But you know what? I lived in New York because I'm from New York. I know what gang leaders are like in New York. Okay. I've been on the receiving end of gang violence. These guys they're not touchy-feely types, I promise you. But that made an impact on that individual to the point where he turned his life over to the Messiah as he understood him. Now, if you tell me that that's not power, you made a different stuff than I am. That's how Yahweh does things. And just as they did not see fit, verse 28, to acknowledge Elohim any longer, Elohim gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness. Then he goes through a whole laundry list, right? Wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of Elohim, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. There's quite a list, right? Disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of Elohim, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. So in the midst of all this, Yahweh says, I have to take matters into my own hands, because the ones I commended the job to are not doing the job. But I'm not going to leave this undone. So in the middle of that, at the peak crescendo of this evil and this poison filling the world, Yahweh sends his son. And what does his son do? He takes upon himself all of that darkness. What does he scream out as this ending? First of all, what happens in the garden? He's praying, it says, as if his sweat is as if drops of blood. I don't believe that's just metaphorical. I believe that he's sweating to the point the stress and strain are so strong that I believe that he's literally sweating drops of blood. And there have been phenomena documented that you can see described. There are things called stigmata that you can see, and that's a little bit different. But there have been instances where you have something like that. And I believe that what he's going through in Gethsemane is he's feeling the weight of this evil. Have you ever been in the presence of evil? Have you ever felt that cold chill up your spine? I'm not talking about Hollywood movies and stuff. I'm talking about really. I have felt that at least twice in my life. I've never heard a voice. I've never had that kind of a intimate experience to that extent. I don't know if other people have. Many people say they have, and I tend not to, question things if I don't understand them or wasn't there. But I've never experienced anything that intimate. But I have felt myself in the presence of evil. It's strange. It's nauseating. I'll give you this one example. I was in New Orleans on a business trip, and I decided to walk through the French Quarter, just to see what everyone talked about the French Quarter this and the French Quarter that. And I went to one shop in the French Quarter that was obviously a new agey type of shop, where it's actually very clean. It wasn't like with a lot of weird stuff that I could tell, right? And I'm in my early 20s, so what do I know as compared to what I know now? But it was very relatively innocuous, but there were things in there that clearly were not things that I would be involved in. And I remember feeling sick to the point, I had not eaten anything that I shouldn't have eaten. I wasn't feeling ill. I didn't feel ill before. I didn't feel ill after. But all I know is that there was a sense inside of me that I had to walk out of that store. I could not remain in that store. I mean, I remember feeling it as palpably as if someone, like I said, I never heard a voice, but it was as palpable as someone came to me and shoved me and said, "You don't need to be here. Get out." It was that sickening a feeling. I felt it once, and I felt it a second time in a nature food store. And you can draw your own conclusions in terms of, I'm not knocking all nature food stores, don't remind you. But this one was kind of off base. It was in a mall. It was in a just a regular mall. And again, that feeling, it was a feeling, a combination of nausea, dread, like there is something wrong here. I can't even put it into words because it's not something I can explain. It's not like this kind of danger. It's like there is something that if I stay here, I'm at peril of my life. And that's the only two instances that I can recall when I felt that. Can you imagine feeling that amplified, 70 times over? This is what Yahshua is feeling. And then on the cross, what does he scream out? He says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my Elohim, why have you forsaken me? And people say, well, he's just quoting the Psalm, right? Psalm 22, because he's quoting the prophetic Psalm. And yeah, but why is he quoting the prophetic Psalm? Well, I believe, and there are many interpretations to this, many of which I don't agree with, some which have merit, but it's my simple observation that I really believe that at that moment, he's feeling the weight so heavy upon him that he feels as if he's been abandoned at that moment. Remember, he's a man. He's not, some superhuman. That he is in his physical flesh and blood, and he has been beaten. He has been tortured. He has been exhausted. He has been on this cross with hatred being spewed at him, and on and on. And in that moment, he feels that weight upon him as he felt it in the garden. It wasn't a lack of faith or a moment of you try going through something and not have some expression of frustration. Haven't you ever expressed yourself in a moment of frustration and anger, and then you quickly shake it off and you keep on moving? Well, why would we not grant Yahshua a moment where he felt that feeling of being alone? And we want to spiritualize that away. Don't do that. Don't spiritualize away everything, because there's a meaning behind that. And in the same way that he felt the weight in the garden, literally on the verge of dying, he feels the weight of being alone at that moment. But he continues and he goes through it, and it's all done and it's finished. And he fulfills all righteousness. There's that term again, which obviously we won't have a chance to get to today. Yahweh willing, next week I'm going to continue this. We're not going to do the Bible hour 1 reading next week. We're going to continue the study, and I want to get through this study. Too much more to do. I've laid a good foundation here with much of what I've already said, and I think that we can go at a faster clip through at least through chapter 2, part of chapter 3, but chapters 3 and 4 are dense, and we're going to have to go a little bit deeper into those, and I don't want to try to rush those things. And so Yahweh willing, we'll continue this. We'll do part 2 next week, but we'll end it with here in chapter 1 with the problem, right? The problem of sin, the problem of idolatry, the problem of spiritual wickedness in high places, and the burden on mankind that includes the wickedness, that includes separation and division between Yahweh's image bearers. How can you fulfill an eternal commission if you yourself are divided? A house that is divided cannot stand. How could Yahweh, in a microcosm, the defenders of Masada stood up against the Romans for 3 years, from 70 Common Era to 73. They stood in Masada and they withstood the Romans. And the Romans, being the brilliant engineers that they were, because they created a ramp to go up, and took them a while to get there. But when they did it, it was all over. But part of what did the defenders of Masada in was because they could never agree with one another. Go look it up. It was this faction and that faction and the other faction. And everybody knew the right way to go. And, I'm not knocking them, because we do the same thing. Okay? Because you have the Sacred Name movement, and you have the Messianic Jews, and then you have, these guys here, and this one uses Yahweh, and this one uses Yahweh, and this one uses Yahshua, this one uses Yeshua, and then this one believes in the tzitzit, and this one says you got to put on the tali, and this one hates the other one because they had the new moon on the wrong day, and this one wants to do a lunar Sabbath, and this one, I'm done. And if it sounds like it's something that makes me angry, it's because it does. And, I don't want to lose control over it, right? But it's frustrating for me, because I say to myself, how much more could we do as a people with the understanding that Yahweh has given us if we could stop with all the petty nonsense? And that's what it is. Am I saying that it's not a good idea to defend against error, to defend against teachings that could lead us astray? No, there's a place for that too. But I really believe that when we look at the final analysis, those things are few and far in between. The things that are truly things over which division should actually take place. Where you say to yourself, there's just no way that we can reconcile this thing. But the kind of things that we choose to fight about as a people, very foolish. And what it does is it makes us look weak in the world. And by the way, I'm including Christianity in that as well. We bend over backwards, we meaning all these groups, sacred name groups, etc., right? We bend over backwards to say, we're not Christians. And I say, of course I'm a Christian. If you haven't heard that from me before, I'll say it very clearly. Of course I'm a Christian, because I come from that same tradition that eventually went into corruption because people adopted pagan ideas, etc. But of course I'm a Christian. I'm not going to try to come up with all kinds of different ways to say it. Now, Christians will not accept me because I don't believe in the Trinity, or because I say Yahweh instead of, the Lord, etc. You know what? You want to be that way with me? That's up to you. But as far as you will let me have fellowship with you, I will have fellowship with you. Now, where we don't agree, then we don't agree. And when Yahshua returns, he'll sort out the mess. And I will do what I can from here to then to sort out whatever I can. And I'm not going to follow outright error. But again, it's above my pay grade. Why am I going through all this? Because I think that the exact things that are happening here in the book of Romans are things that we're experiencing on a different level in our day. And all it does is it makes us look weak to the world. We can't have a united front in a world that is where these same forces of darkness are reaching their pitch level again. And if you doubt that, you're not keeping your ear to the ground, and you're not living in the same kind of world. You're watching too much Netflix and busying yourself with other things than paying attention to what's happening around you. And until we can have a more united front, we're going to look like a joke to the people of this world who would choose to, and I'm not talking about the average person. The average person is just confused, my friends. But I'm talking about those out there who have a certain degree, or so they think, of power and influence, who are the ones who are forming and shaping this world according to their image. And everyone else is just in the middle trying to figure out what to do. We are here to give a witness to all the masses who need to hear that Yahshua is king, that there is a king, and that he loves them, and that he wants their good for them. And we can't do that if we're constantly bickering, if we're constantly worrying about this doctrine and that doctrine and choosing to have 5,000 minutia divide us. So I can go on a whole diatribe here. I won't do that, but I want to continue this next week if you'll join me, because I think that these are important things to talk about. And I think that we're seeing similar things happening in our day, that they are very relevant to our day. We got to do better. We got to do better to hear Paul and to see him in our day and not just on the page. That's why I say, forget about doctrines. Forget about theology. This is real life. This is what we're living today. Can we fulfill in our day our responsibility, our part in proclaiming the gospel? Our master began, and those around him in his associated field, like John the Baptizer and his apostles, his disciples, they began the work. Can we finish it in our day? Can we continue what's left unwritten in the book of Acts? After Acts 28, I've always said Acts 28 ends much too abruptly. There's more. There's more to be written. There's room left at the end to write. I believe it's our responsibility, the believers of the day, the believers in Yahshua of the day. I believe it's our responsibility to write that ending. How are we going to write it? With more bickering and division and suspicion and hatred? Or are we going to find a way to come together under the banner of Yahweh Nissi? I hope it's the latter.